Hey everybody, welcome to today's video. This is going to be the first video in a series of 5 that I put out once a week in the month of October. And we're going to be talking about some true crime cases that happened here in Charlotte, North Carolina, which is where I live currently. So I hope you enjoy this video and I really hope you like this whole series. Today I have brought us to a beautiful public park called Freedom Park, because for the story that I want to talk about today, there really are not a lot of sites that I can boots on the ground go film. This case happened so long ago that there is not much left for me to show the vlog. I have been to a couple places around town just to give you some idea of the area that she lived in. But for this video, mostly I'm going to walk around this public park and film beautiful things while I tell you the tragic story of what happened to the young Kim Thomas. Kim Thomas and her husband, Dr. Edward Friedland, had been together ever since their college years in Rochester, New York. Dr. Friedland became a kidney specialist, and after college, they moved to Miami for his work. Kim took a job as an on-air financial analyst. In 1986, Dr. Friedland moved to Charlotte, North Carolina to take a position as a director at a dialysis center, and Kim helped him with the necessary tasks to start up and grow the business. She also took a leadership role at the local chapter of the National Organization of Women, and she co-authored a book with a friend called A Charlotte Child, a guide for the pregnant woman. Kim had dreamed all of her life of becoming a mother, but Ed had misgivings about them becoming parents, as he thought he needed to spend too much time at the dialysis clinic to be properly involved as a father. However, Kim convinced him to adopt a child with her, and they became the first couple in North Carolina to have an independent adoption without using an agency when they adopted their son. They bought a home in a deep wooded lot in the older but affluent Cotswold neighborhood, a home full of windows and natural light. Life was really looking good for this young family. That is, until the evening of July 27, 1990. Dr. Friedland came home from work that evening and was horrified by the sight that he found. Kim was lying on their dining room floor with her hands handcuffed behind her back and her throat slashed multiple times. Their 10-month-old baby was crying in his crib. Dr. Friedland immediately placed a 911 call for help, but he was accused later of being too calm and unemotional in his conversations with police. He told 911 that he saw Kim's body on the floor and he could immediately tell that she was dead, even from across the room 20 feet away and in the dark, which the police thought was suspicious. Also suspicious was the fact that Dr. Friedland did not check Kim for vital signs at the scene. To be fair, from the description of the crime scene, I think any trained medical professional would probably have been able to tell that Kim was dead, as she had lain on the floor for many hours and there had been a tremendous loss of blood. Forensics determined that Kim had been murdered in the early to mid-morning hours of July 27th, most likely before 8:30 a.m., based on unanswered phone calls from her friends, and she had lain on the floor in the house all day. She had initially been attacked in her bedroom and handcuffed before being moved into the living room. Her throat was slashed between 22 and 26 times, with cuts going all the way to her spinal column. Nothing was stolen from the home, and there were no signs of forced entry to the house. There was also initially no sign of sexual assault. Dr. Friedland continued to maintain a calm, distant, and unemotional demeanor, and he was, of course, immediately a suspect of interest to the police. He was able to recall his day and schedule in remarkable, almost suspicious detail. As investigators started to poke into the private lives of both him and his wife, cracks began to appear in what had initially appeared to be a happy marriage. Reports were called in to police that Dr. Friedland was having an affair or multiple affairs behind his wife's back, and Kim's journals revealed that they had gone back and forth for years before getting married and before deciding to adopt a child together. She journaled extensively about her struggles to get pregnant and Ed's unsupportive aloofness during that time. She had even told her sister prior to her murder that she sensed that they might be headed for a divorce. All in all, Dr. Friedland was really not coming across very well in the glare of all the publicity. However, years went by without any formal arrest in the murder of Kim Thomas, and the case was clearly going cold. 4 years after the murder, in July of 1994, Dr. Edward Friedland was formally charged with his wife's murder. He was granted bond and allowed to return home. The timing of Kim's death became a key element in the case. Dr. Friedland maintained that he had left for work around 7:45 to 8 o'clock in the morning, and his testimony was corroborated by his coworkers. If Kim had died before 7:30 in the morning, Dr. Friedland would have been home and would have had the opportunity to commit the murder. In 1995, Dr. Michael Bodden of the New York City Medical Examiner's Office appeared in a Charlotte court to testify about the timing of Kim's death. Dr. Michael Sullivan of the Mecklenburg County Medical Examiner's Office had performed the initial autopsy of Kim Thomas and testified that she likely died in the, quote, early hours of the morning, before 7:30 a.m. Dr. Bodden wasn't able to say he was reasonably certain that she had died before 7:30 a.m., only that he believed it to have been more likely that she died so early. Meanwhile, Dr. Friedland's defense attorney, David Rudolph, called the tests used by Dr. Bodden voodoo evidence and argued that the criminal case should be dismissed. The cases against Dr. Friedland, both criminal and civil, were David Rudolph's first high-profile Charlotte cases. He would later go on to represent Panthers star Ray Carruth and also Michael Peterson, the novelist accused of killing his wife and the subject of the Netflix series The Staircase. Ultimately, in this case, the judge ruled that there wasn't enough evidence to meet the burden of proof on what time specifically Kim Thomas had died. And without that key forensic information, the district attorney's office had no choice but to drop the charges against Dr. Friedland. For a criminal prosecutor, this was a tough call to make, because once a case is lost and a defendant is acquitted, that case cannot be reopened and new charges brought up. Even if damning evidence later surfaces, the case is over. None of this sat well in the eyes of the public, who were very quick to assume that the husband or boyfriend is the most likely culprit of a crime. The police decided to take another line of investigation, assuming at this point that Dr. Friedland must have hired a hitman. However, nothing ever surfaced to suggest that speculation, and eventually the case ran cold again. Kim's parents went public regularly, asking the public for any information, trying to keep her memory alive in the public eyes. Articles and photos appeared in print on every anniversary, trying to remind the public that Kim's murderer is still out there on the loose, and what a kindness and service it would be to help bring him to justice. Dr. Friedland knew that the only way to reclaim his life and prove his innocence was to find out who had actually committed the murder. In 1996, he again hired attorney David Rudolph and brought a civil lawsuit forward against the man that he believed had killed Kim Thomas, a local handyman and career criminal named Marion Gales. Marion Gales had been on the police radar from the first few hours at the crime scene. A friend of Kim's had suggested to officers to look into him, and Gales' own brother-in-law called police the day after the murder to report that Gales, quote, wasn't acting right. Others came forward in later years to report that Gales had admitted to killing Kim. Initially, reports that Dr. Friedland was pursuing a civil case against a poor local handyman were met with derision and ridicule. Gales couldn't afford a high-profile attorney to represent him, and people couldn't believe Gales could have pulled off this crime without leaving behind any physical evidence. As nothing was stolen from the scene, and Kim had not been sexually assaulted, it seemed like there was no motive. However, the evidence that David Rudolph presented were as follows. Gales lived a 5-minute walk across Wendover Road from Kim Thomas's house. A neighbor saw Gales in the area around 4:30 in the morning and reported that Gales looked, quote, high. Witnesses said that Gale did own handcuffs and handcuffs were never linked to Dr. Friedland. Gales was seen on the day of the murder wearing bloody clothes and the same type of shoes which ultimately matched a bloody shoe print at the scene. Gales had a long history of breaking in and of violence. In 1979, he had broken into a house just down the street from Kim Thomas's house, and he had shot a woman non-fatally in the arm. The crime followed a pattern Gales had before of breaking into houses where he had once done handiwork and where, from the outside, he could see in through large windows. Stabbing is a sign of anger, which could point to a husband, but also a sign of frustration and agitation, which could point to a drug user or to someone under the influence. Nothing was reported stolen, and everything of Kim's seemed to be left behind at the house. But after the murder, Gales was suddenly seen with unexpected amounts of cash. It's possible that Dr. Friedland did not know how much cash Kim had on her at the time and did not know that any of it was missing. Gales claimed he did not know Kim Thomas, which was a lie, because one of her friends who had been at her house one day had seen Gales walk out of the woods and through her yard. At the time, Kim told her that Gales was a handyman in the neighborhood who had done some work on her deck chairs and walkway that summer. Police found no physical evidence from Gales at the scene, and he was known to be sloppy in his crime scenes, as evidenced by his numerous other arrests in the past. But it's possible that the crime scene processing may have missed evidence, given some testimony from those at the scene. It's also possible that Dr. Friedland hired Marion Gales to be his hitman, but that's unlikely. Why would he hire someone with such a penchant for getting caught? It's even less likely he would hire someone who could countersue and tie him to the murder. In October of 1997, a jury awarded damages to Dr. Friedland of $8.6 million, which of course Marion Gales could never hope to repay. Although the verdict was a relatively hollow success, it did help to begin to clear Dr. Friedland's name. He moved away to Florida in 1998 and started a new practice. He remarried, continued to raise his adopted son, and had several other children with his new wife. Today, he practices as an internist and nephrologist in Pensacola, Florida. But simply winning the civil case did not preempt criminal charges against Marion Gales. Kim's family was left devastated and no closer to answers than they had ever been. The case continued to remain cold, and no arrests were ever made. Over a decade later, in July of 2008, Marion Gales was arrested for the murder of pregnant, homeless 27-year-old LaKoya Monique Martin when his DNA linked him to her body. This was the 9th time he had been arrested. He denied killing her, but he made an Alford plea, which allowed him to avoid admitting guilt while admitting that the state had enough evidence to convict him of her murder. He was sentenced to voluntary manslaughter and currently has a projected release date in 2025. In September of 2013, Kim Thomas's friends planted a red sunset maple tree in Freedom Park to honor her 23 years after her murder. Her son, who was then 24 years old, came into town for the ceremony. He had been too young to remember his mother or the years when his father was under intense scrutiny and suspicion for her murder. Kim's cremains are interred at the Riverside Cemetery in Rochester, New York. There have been interesting new developments in this case as recently as January of this year. On January 1st, 2024, the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department publicly released new information about DNA evidence from the murder of Kim Thomas, evidence that attorney David Rudolph has been pushing to have released for years as it clears his client Dr. Friedland from any suspicion. A DNA profile that was consistent with Marion Gales' DNA was found on the rug where Kim Thomas's body was found, on the bedspread where the attack began, and on pubic hair combings from Kim Thomas's body. The odds that the DNA belongs to anyone other than Marion Gales is 1 in 27 million. However, to date, Marion Gales has still not been formally charged with the murder.
Okay, everybody, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you enjoyed this little tour of Freedom Park also. Since there isn't much left that I can film to show you from Kim Thomas's life here in Charlotte, I thought probably she would be the kind of person who would enjoy a nice stroll in nature and enjoy some beautiful plants, great landscaping. Look at all those people that were outdoors having fun today. I feel like this is the kind of place where she would be happy. So this was the best I could do to walk and talk and tell you about the terrible thing that happened to Kim Thomas. And I am very much hoping that the new evidence that has come to light will completely exonerate her husband, Dr. Friedland, and perhaps get the right person behind bars serving the sentence that the family has waited all these years for. It is beyond time to get some justice for Kim Thomas. All right, everybody, I hope you've enjoyed this video. I have 4 more planned in the series, and I have more places to show you in all of those cases, and we're going to talk about each and every one of these true crimes. So, all right, I'll see you guys another day in another adventure. Bye, everybody.